Welcome back to the 411 on Wrestling Podcast. I'm your host, Blake Lovell, back here on the podcast. Took a little bit of a break last week doing some writing stuff and all of that, which we'll discuss a little bit later on, but have a lot going on, of course, in wrestling right now. And let's talk specifically on this episode about the AEW World Title Eliminator Tournament, which the bracket for that was revealed on Saturday Night Dynamite, which, as we know, will be a theme here over a couple of weeks. But the bracket was finally revealed. The 8 participants that will go at it in this tournament to crown a number 1 contender for the AEW World Championship. And if we go through the bracket, and then we'll break down each of the matchups and make a few picks, how this could unfold. In the top left part of the bracket, it'll be 10 from the Dark Order, Preston Vance, going one-on-one with Jon Moxley. And then you go to the bottom of that, Orange Cassidy taking on Powerhouse Hobbs. Dustin Rhodes on the other side of the bracket goes one-on-one with Bryan Danielson. And then it will be quite an interesting first-round matchup. Probably the most, at least for me, the most intriguing first-round match here, which is going to be Lance Archer against Eddie Kingston. I think the World Title Eliminator Tournament has always been pretty fascinating. I think if you go back to last year, we know from the very beginning, at least, when I did my predictions and all that last year for this tournament, it seemed too obvious that it was going to be Kenny Omega and Hangman Page. But I think, as I said at the time, sometimes that's okay if it is kind of obvious where things are going to head with this. And I think in this scenario, and yes, there is a little bit of a potential spoiler that came out when we all dissected Tony Khan's notebook. And the beauty of the internet is that I guess you can really find anything and see anything in any photo that you want to. And being able to zoom in the photo, which a lot of people were like, wait a second, why is potentially Bryan Danielson going to face Jon Moxley at Full Gear? And is this real? Could this actually be a thing? Well, now that the tournament bracket has come out, you can put 2 and 2 together and wonder if that is actually going to be the match in terms of the finals here. But I think, again, when you look back at last year with Omega and Page, it just made too much sense. And now, you fast forward a year, and the World Title Eliminator Final is going to be your AEW World Championship match here at this year's edition of Full Gear. So there's a lot of things you could do with this tournament, and I think they've made it, pretty special. Last year's was special in terms of knowing you were going to get that match, probably even if it was very predictable in a lot of sense. Could it be the same case this year, where if you just look at how the bracket's made up, it seems like the only scenario is going to be that Danielson versus Moxley final, but could that, change based on, that potential spoiler that got out there? Could that result in some changes? I don't necessarily think so. I mean, we look at each of these matches individually. I think some of the people have talked about, just the makeup of this tournament and, different people that are here or there. But I think when you look at the ranking system, you kind of understand that this is what they try to do. Like, they try to do this by rankings and try to figure out, how do we put these people in this slot in this tournament? And I think when you look at Preston Vance, 10 from the Dark Order, I mean, he's won a lot of matches this year. And as someone who covers, AW Dark for the site, and he's had a lot of singles matches. And, he was winning pretty much all of those. And so he has racked up a lot of wins. And so I think this is something else about this tournament is when you have a tournament like this, you want to be able to put in some people that can perhaps, have a little bit of shine. You want to give them a little bit of a spotlight and maybe give them that opportunity that, on your weekly 3 hours of television, you just don't have a whole lot of spots to put them in, which I think, the Dark Order has been up and down in terms of where they've been slotted and all that, but just in terms of a Preston Vance singles match, you're not getting that a whole lot on Dynamite or Rampage. So I think it's fine, to have this set up because it does give him an opportunity to go up against Moxley and, probably going to be a pretty hard-hitting match with those two and what they could, kind of display there. So it's a fun first-round match. I mean, clearly I'm going to pick Moxley here because I just think that, again, we probably know where things are headed with the final, but the path to get there and what actually happens once you get there, I think that's the most interesting aspect of this tournament. Down to Orange Cassidy and Powerhouse Hobbs. I will say there is spoilers out there already for this week's Rampage, which that match is going to take place. I think it's, without spoiling it, I mean, I think it's interesting because I don't know that you can go wrong either way here. We know for AEW what the, kind of stock they put, Tony Khan, the stock he's put in Orange Cassidy over the years now. And, we kind of understand that he's always going to have a chance to be put in one of these prominent spots just based on he's still a very overact. I mean, he's just still someone that, you're going to get a reaction from the crowd. And I think it's just such a different dynamic, isn't it, with Cassidy and looking at Powerhouse Hobbs here. And I think they've had a match before. I'm trying to remember going back to maybe AEW Dark at some point. I probably need to look that up, but I think I remember them having a match on AEW Dark at one point or another. And certainly it was Orange winning that match. But I think Hobbs is just such a fascinating figure at this point because, he's been put in some of these spots, whether it's the match against CM Punk, whether it's others. I mean, just being placed in Team Taz, that's obviously given him a much bigger platform than it would have been, before when he was just sort of a singles wrestler that you knew had a lot of potential. We could see it right away that this was someone that was going to, be a big player in AEW at some point down the line. And now, he does have this bigger stage now where he's having matches against Punk. Now he's got this match against Orange Cassidy. I'm just curious maybe what the next move is for Hobbs. And does he just continue to sort of just settle maybe into that role of being, right there with Ricky Starks, and we know Hook, who has become an internet legend at this point. But I'm curious kind of what maybe the next move is for Hobbs in terms of how do they use him? But there's nothing, the Team Task thing works, right? And it's worked very well. And so there's right now, there's no reason I'm not saying to take Powerhouse Hobbs out of Team Taz or anything, but I do think there's still a ton of potential there. And, he's really good. And I think just, playing him up as a heel has really worked very well with his mannerisms and facial expressions and all that. So again, if you check the spoilers, which we do have them on the website, 41mania.com, a winner has already been decided in this match, so I won't pick it to therefore, not give anything away. But I don't think I would have had a problem either way with this one. Even if, maybe I lean more towards the Hobbs aspect, just because I think it maybe offers an interesting dynamic in that second round match against Moxley. But, Moxley versus Orange, that's another one that's a very different sort of match that, you don't get every single day in AEW. So that is also another dynamic that could be very interesting on that. To the other side of the bracket, Danielson versus Rhodes. I mean, again, you know that Bryan Danielson's going to win this match. I don't think Dustin Rhodes is beating Bryan Danielson in the first round of this Eliminator tournament. But, I mean, it is another one where it's like, all right, well, you get Bryan Danielson versus Dustin Rhodes, two guys who, certainly have been very good throughout their career in the ring. And I'm sure they'll have a chance to put on a pretty fun match. And it'll be very entertaining. And even if you already know that the winner is going to be Danielson, like it's just that it's how they get there. And I think that's what you kind of have to look at this as. It's just, sure, could the bracket be done a little bit differently in terms of maybe adding a little bit more unpredictability to this? Of course it could have. But I think at the end of the day, remember, for me, it's like, well, you want to get from point A to point B, and even if you know how you're going to get there, I think it's once you actually get to point B, what happens then? And I think maybe that's the biggest draw with this tournament right now, because for this one, I mean, everyone's going to be picking Danielson to win. We know after the match with Omega, he already has a claim to not losing to Omega. Now, of course, is Kenny Omega actually going to be the champion after Full Gear? I don't think so. I suppose they could do something different there, but I think now's the time to, certainly make that switch to Hangman. He is just wildly over. We see that since he's returned, even before, you just saw it building and building and building. I think there's very little doubt that you have to make that switch now and put the title on Hangman. But again, that's where when you get to point B, that could offer a lot of different dynamics in terms of who wins this tournament. Because that, what's that first feud look like for Hangman? And I think there's a lot in play there that you can work with. But Danielson is going to beat Dustin Rhodes. I feel pretty confident in saying that. And he will advance to the semifinals there. Now back to the one we said a minute ago, I think is the most fascinating. That's Archer versus Kingston. Lance Archer is someone that I have seen a lot of, people, probably myself included at times. You want to see more from Lance Archer, and that's not saying that it's Lance Archer. It's you want to see, I think, more from him in AEW. You want to maybe see him used in different ways. He has had a lot of these squash matches, whether it's on Dark Elevation, whatever. And even spots on Dynamite, of course. But I just think that, there was a time where you kind of looked at Archer and said, all right, like he is next world champion type guy. Like he is just has such a different presentation. His entrance, I keep saying, is one of the best in the business right now. Just him coming in and just destroying people during his entrance and everything. It's so fun. But I mean, he just hasn't yet. I mean, he's main event. We know, like the matches with Moxley. We know all of that. He's been put in some of these featured spots, and we know we've talked about the challenges that come with AEW and the roster, and having those 3 hours of just television time with 2 hours of Dynamite, 1 hour of Rampage. You've got your YouTube shows with Dark and Dark Elevation, but those 3 hours of primetime TV, like those are your big hours. Like those are the ones that you want to try to fit so much into. And as we've seen, that's been an issue at times because they haven't been able to always fit everything in they want to fit in. And maybe that does lead to eventually, Rampage moving times or something, going to more than just an hour. I don't know what that looks like. But I think Archer is one of those examples you point to and say, in a perfect scenario, you want to see more from Lance Archer, I think, because he is such sort of a different character. He offers a different, sort of feel to things. And that's why I think this match with Kingston is so fun because really, I could see this one going either way. Bryan Danielson versus Lance Archer, sign me up. Bryan Danielson versus Eddie Kingston, sign me up. I think there's an interesting dynamic here because if we assume and we predict, let's say we predict it's going to be Danielson versus Moxley in the final, I think there's certainly something you could do with Danielson versus Kingston in one semifinal to maybe add another element to that final match where it's like, all right, Moxley and Kingston are buds. What does Danielson, like, what kind of dynamic could you put in play in that semifinal between Danielson and Kingston that could maybe lead to something, adding an additional layer of the story to the final between Danielson and Moxley? So I think there's a very appealing aspect to that. But I also think that, again, Bryan Danielson versus Lance Archer, I'm all for that. Like, I think that's such a different match. It's, different styles, and I think that's what you're going to see here with Danielson. We've talked about it kind of in the matches he's had thus far. Like, there's a lot of different styles here to work with in this tournament in and of itself. And Danielson, should he get to the final, like he's going to go through a lot of different ones here, just based on the opponents that he's going to face. So this was a hard one to pick for me because it's tough to call. I think that given what could happen in the final between Danielson and Moxley, and we'll talk about that in a second, I think Kingston is an interesting choice here because there is something that could play into that. But I also think that I don't necessarily want to see Lance Archer lose at this point either. And I don't know that, Eddie Kingston losing is good either. But I think in this scenario, like I wouldn't mind seeing Archer get a big win here because I think it is something that they could certainly do and work with, kind of push forward, because that Danielson Archer match would be a change of pace for sure. But this is a tough call on this one. I will go Kingston, although I don't know that that's going to happen. I don't know that it's necessarily the right decision, but and I'm saying that because of Lance Archer. Like I don't know that Archer losing this match would be great for him. But we say this too, like there's always interference. There's always different things you can do to kind of justify some of these losses, even though, in AEW for the most part, we're used to seeing just, good matches and, not necessarily always having the shenanigans with the finish, although we have seen that at times. We're not saying that they don't do that at all, but I think I'm most interested in seeing maybe Danielson versus Kingston because I think there is an element in play there that you could use going into the final. And let's just talk about that because obviously I'm going to pick Moxley to beat, whether it's Cassidy, Hobbs, wink, wink. You already know who it is if you've read the spoilers. Put Moxley in there, and we're going to put Danielson in the final. And that's where I think, this is the hardest part to predict because let's say Hangman does win the championship. Then you can pretty much, it's a toss up. Like, which direction do you want to go? And even if Omega wins, I think that in and of itself is like, all right, I don't necessarily think they're going to go back to Omega and Moxley. But I do think there's obviously a built-in reason for them to go back to Omega and Danielson for the championship. So I think that is another factor that's going to come into this. But I've seen a lot of people throw around the idea that if you get to Danielson and Moxley, there is an opportunity there for a potential like Jon Moxley heel turn, something like that. And that's where I think, that's where things really start to get interesting for me. If that is perhaps the direction you go in, because, I think with Moxley, when you kind of think of his style and just everything that comes along with the character, like there are already, I think, some of those heel tendencies to him, but I do think that it's something where it's something you could possibly explore there and play it up a different way. But I still think that there's again, if we go back and say we get Danielson and Kingston, if that is a scenario you run with, and let's say there is something where you start to, add much more of an edge to Moxley, or maybe it is like a full-blown heel turn, something like that, that's where I think, that semifinal match with Danielson and Kingston, there's something you could play into that with, and I don't know exactly what that is, because again, this is that layer of unpredictability that is in this tournament, even if you think that we already kind of know who could probably get to the finals, there is kind of that match between Archer and Kingston, I think, is going to determine a lot of things that could play out here. Is Danielson the right person to feud right away with Hangman Page? Because you have Page built up as this top babyface, and then you've got Danielson, who comes in to the company as the top babyface, aside from Punk, who's also made, his entrance there at AEW. That can be a challenging thing, I think, to pull off, because you're gonna take some of that buzz away from one or the other. And you don't, if I'm a fan, I don't want to root against either Page or Danielson. So maybe that's not the direction you go in. But if you do a Hangman Page versus, maybe an evolved character of Jon Moxley, maybe there's something to that. And maybe that offers you an opportunity to do something a little bit different. So it's a tough call here. I don't think it's as simple as saying Bryan Danielson is going to win this tournament. I think there's a lot more to it. And even if the first round matches to some seem a little underwhelming from a predictability standpoint, I think there's going to be some good matches. And I think that once you get to the semifinals, there are some of those, storyline elements you can really start to build in. Even if they play out in the first round too, there's some of those elements you can start to build in that could really impact what you're going to see once you get to the finals. Now look, could they go complete curveball and maybe it's Danielson versus Cassidy or something? Like I'm sure that's a possibility, but I don't see that happening. I think the best play here is to do Danielson versus Moxley, because I think there's a whole lot more you can work with, in terms of offering that first big challenge to Hangman. And what does it mean for Danielson if he loses? What does it mean for Moxley if he loses? Or vice versa. It's like, what does it mean for Moxley if he wins? Like, is there sort of a character change there? For Danielson, what does that mean in a feud or a match with Hangman Page? Like, I think there's a lot you can do with that. So I will give AEW credit for that, because even if, again, predictability, which to me is not a huge deal, because, you know the matches you want to see, the matches the fans want to see. And, it probably is some sort of combination of Danielson and Moxley, just with the bracket playing out the way it has. Hey, you could always do Kingston versus Moxley too. I mean, I assume that's a possibility as well. I don't think they'll do Archer versus Moxley or anything like that, but it just seems like a safe bet that Danielson's going to get to the finals. If he didn't, in some, alternate scenario, Moxley versus Kingston, people would sign up for that, but I think you'd really have to, do something a little bit different with that potential Kingston-Danielson semifinal. But it does seem like everything pointing towards Danielson and Moxley. I'm fine with that, because I think it's not just, okay, we know that's probably the match we're getting. It's what do they do when they get to that match? And then what does that mean for the champion, whether that is Omega, whether that is Page, coming out of Full Gear? So I think there's some value there in that with this particular tournament. So there are some thoughts on the World Title Eliminator tournament, and again, it'll all start to play out on Rampage, Dynamite, and all that moving forward as we head towards Full Gear on November the 13th in Minneapolis. And yeah, let us know what you think over on the site, 401mania.com. We've got the bracket posted over there. We'll put the link to that as well in the show notes. So you can see the full bracket, and you can see all of our great users and everybody commenting on this. There's a lot of comments and a lot of predictions on what could play out here. So be sure to join the fun and see kind of what you think. Like, what do you look at and see how you see this thing playing out? Like, do you think it's going to be something that is as simple as Danielson versus Moxley? If you do, what do you think about how it could play out? Maybe where they go from there. I think there are some interesting questions you can certainly ask about this tournament, just based on the characters involved and the potential storyline directions that they could go in coming out of this tournament. So be sure to check that out at 41mania.com. We'll be back with another episode of the podcast here coming up to preview WWE Crown Jewel, which will take place on Thursday. That will be certainly an early start during the day. So we will preview that in another episode of the podcast this week. So we'll have that coming up, talk a little bit about maybe what we can expect from that show and everything else. Of course, 401mania.com. Check out all our news, columns, reviews, everything. I've got several new columns up over there. Did some columns on Adam Cole, kind of looking at his decision to make the move from WWE to AEW and how it's played out thus far. We did some thoughts on the WWE Queen's Crown tournament and the time involved in that tournament, or the lack thereof, when it comes to the total match time and maybe what that has meant for the state of WWE's women's division. Also have a new column up, our Wrestling with Kayfabe, which is a fun one to do. It's going to be a weekly column looking back at an old magazine from wrestling's past, and we've done a couple of the Pro Wrestling Illustrated. So if you're a big fan of the PWI back in the day, I've got a couple new columns up on that here over the past week here, looking at just a lot of fun stuff from back in the day to give you sort of a different view on what was going on in wrestling from a kayfabe standpoint. Pretty fun to look back at those, and I know some of you guys have had some great feedback to that and really enjoy it. So it's a good trip down memory lane, so check those out. I'll put one of those in the links to the show notes as well. So check out all of our stuff over there. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast, any podcast app you use. Search for 41 on Wrestling, and as always, we will have the link to the GoFundMe for Larry Zonka's family in the show notes. Be sure to continue to share and contribute to that if you can, and everything else, 401mania.com. But thanks as always for listening to the podcast, and we'll talk to you next time here on the 411 on Wrestling podcast.